everyone, glad to have you with us as we are starting a new Bible study today as the church here at Epiphany Adult Bible Class, making our way through the book of Esther. I'm Pastor John. I'm Pastor Nathan. You're Pastor John.
You're Pastor John wannabe.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so she's got the whole thing going on here. We are glad to have you with us. Like I said, we're starting a new study on the book of Esther. Last time around, we finished our book or our study on the church year. And if you want to take some time with that, we've got many studies on that. We have about 6 months worth of material on that. If you want to go look at that and follow why the church year is important and matters in the 21st century in the life of the follower of Jesus, even today. But, the book of Esther is an interesting book, isn't it?
It is incredibly interesting.
And highly relevant for our time. What are some parallels between Esther and our
as we're going to see
times?
As we jump into the book of Esther, it was a time of political upheaval.
Yeah.
There were lots of things going on. There was discord. There were people being pitted against other people, and something that we know pretty well in our day and age.
Well, there was racial tension and injustice, as we'll see later on in the book. There was even there's even a potential wiping out of one race by another race. We'll also see some deep-seated and deep-rooted kind of animosity between, that goes back hundreds and hundreds of years between enemies of the Jews and the Jews in this particular book. And we also see some interesting kind of external things going on. There are wars and rumors of wars happening too, which aren't specifically mentioned in the book, but yet from extra-biblical data we know are happening around the time that this narrative is placed.
That's right.
So that's where we're heading. We hope that you will enjoy, learn, and maybe be able to draw your own parallels between the book of Esther, what was happening in the 5th century BC in Persia, and what's happening today in the 21st century. And ultimately our hope is that you will draw comfort and assurance from knowing that the God who sometimes reveals himself in history, but often does not, is always working behind history for the good of his people.
Yep.
And that's what we see here happening in Esther.
He will accomplish his plans. I think we mentioned this in the study of the church year. I think a good way to prepare to really understand Esther is to read Psalm 2.
Yeah.
The kings of the nations, they make their plans and they rail against God and he laughs.
Yeah.
But because he's working and he will accomplish his plan, and that is the salvation of people.
Right. And that's what we see going on in the book of Esther. So we're just going to dive on in. You can download the study guide in the description box if you're on YouTube. The date written for the book of Esther is 400 BC. But the date of the events is 483 to 478-ish. It's somewhere in that ballpark of the events of Esther. So talk about this. Is this a problem for us that it's such a long distance between the time when it was written and the time that it actually happened? Or what should we make of that, I guess?
It's not a problem simply because there are people today who are writing about the Revolutionary War. There are people today, and that's 200 years ago. So what we see here is that whoever wrote this, and we're not sure who wrote Esther, but certainly he was or she was a historian. We know this because they're mentioning historical events, historical people, and it just smacks of something that has actually happened, and if not by an eyewitness, by someone who lived not long after the events of what took place.
They had to have been relatively close and relatively well informed in order to be able to give us such an accurate description of of how things would have worked in the Persian kind of upper echelons and the royalty of Persia at the time.
Yeah, this person obviously was educated, was very well informed about the traditions, the politics, and the things that are happening not only in Persia, but in other parts of the world at the time.
The name of God, one interesting quirk about the book of Esther is the name of God's not mentioned in the entire book. Yeah. So how does that impact our reading of the book of Esther?
As I mentioned to you a few years ago, I had a chance to go to Israel, and we went, when we were at Joppa, they were celebrating Purim, which is one of the festivals that, the festival that they're going to highlight in the book of Esther. And everyone was wearing masks, and I said, what's going on with all the masks? And they explained to me, well, Purim was the fact that God was working behind the scenes in order to save his people Israel. And so even though God is not specifically mentioned by name, we see his work all over the place. So it's not a problem. It's just the truth, as Luther once called God, the hidden God. He often hides behind the events of history, but he's the one who is controlling the events of history to accomplish his plan and purpose.
This is a huge thing for us in the 21st century, and all the tumults of, like, we've had a pandemic, we've got uncertainty about the future of the country in which we live, but there's all sorts of tumults around the world. It doesn't matter if you're in the United States or anywhere else. There are tumults, there are wars and rumors of wars, and it is so comforting to know that this has not changed in 2,600 years, right. 2,500 years. It's been going on for a long time, and that our God is still in control behind the scenes.
And it is not just above it all or behind it all. He really does work in it all to accomplish his plans.
Right. So that's one of the things that we want to see in the book of Esther, is how is God working, even though he's not explicitly mentioned, or there's not a ton of explicit kind of like devotional or spiritual practices. It's just life, and they're doing life and trying to figure out how to do this with God, with the understanding that God is in all of it and through all of it working. And there's an implicit trust of what he's doing there in the world.
Well, you'll be reading the book of Esther and say, wow, was that lucky? Or what a coincidence. And I'm reminded of something I saw when I first moved to Pearland back in 1989. I was meeting at one of our members' homes, and she had a placard on her refrigerator defining a coincidence. And the definition is a little miracle where God chooses to remain anonymous.
So that's one of the things that's going on in the book of Esther. The other thing, as you mentioned before, is Esther is a narrative, a historical narrative that is reminding God's people of the origins of the festival of Purim. The themes then that we're going to see with this is that God is working through seemingly random chance even in order to deliver his people as well. Because Purim, pure, is Aramaic for a lot. Literally a dice. That's right. Because a lot of the decisions about what events should take place and when they should take place, we're going to see this in the book actually, were done by lot. And so this is a reference to Haman's casting the dice. This is the enemy that tries to kill all the Jews throughout the empire. Cast dice for when that should take place. Like, when should the purge happen? And it happens to be a way long time, plenty of time for things to get in place so that God's people can defend themselves. But that's the reference to this, that God is even behind the lot. What is it? I believe it's the Psalm or Proverbs where it says, well, God's the one who's behind every cast of the dice. God's, every decision of the lot, every kind of a lot is from the Lord.
Well, and that was a typical practice, not only in Persia, but among Israel. When, in the New Testament, when they want to fill the spot vacated by Judas Iscariot, well, what do the disciples do, the apostles? They cast lots between two choices.
And then trusting that the Lord was behind the lot, that he was going to be guiding whoever was going to take Judas's spot. So themes then beyond this too. So God's not mentioned. It's the origin story of the festival of Purim. There are other themes that are happening in here too, like deliverance from enemies, God's constant work behind the scenes, the Lord thwarting grudges and hatred, which we're going to see with Haman, the danger of pride, proper conduct of kings, the danger of alcohol abuse by leaders. We see that in chapter 1 straight up, that this is, don't do it is the point. And because of these themes, actually, how these themes run through the scripture, in the Hebrew Bible, Esther's not placed with the historical books. Like in our Bibles, it's Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther at the very end of the Chronicles and Judges and all that historical narrative. In the Hebrew Bible, it's actually placed with wisdom literature, with like Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and so forth, Song of Songs. So the question then is this. If there's so many of these themes and the Hebrew Bible puts it in wisdom literature as opposed to historical narrative, should we treat Esther more like Aesop's fable? It's a nice story with a point, or more like historical narrative that this happened in real history?
I don't think there's any question that it's real history, because the author is talking about real historical people and a real historical time period. There's a lot of wisdom that is revealed in this, so I can understand why it would be placed in the wisdom literature. But from my reading of Scripture and most conservative scholars, this is solidly historical.
I mean, there's a few different ways we could take that. One, the narrator actually says this took place. Like, this is what happened at this time. Yep. So he dates it, he puts it in history. He gives it a solid kind of rock in history. The other thing is what we were mentioning earlier, which is all of the great kind of knowledge of what's happening in the inner circle and the court of Xerxes, and what would have taken place, and how royals behaved, and how he and how he roots it kind of with a lot of concrete data. Says this happened. I mean, this is something that wasn't just a magical fairy tale that you know about Esther, you know, becoming a princess and then saving her people. This is God working in the world. What we should do, though, is just because this is historical narrative doesn't mean this isn't a good writer. This author knows what he's doing. He's an excellent literary type person. He knows how to put a story together. And so there's three things we need to watch out for when it comes to how this story is put together. The first is irony. And one irony, some of it's hilarious and some of it's kind of dark. One of the hilarious points is Ahasuerus in chapter 1 wants to show he has total control of his wife, and ultimately displays the fact that he doesn't. He's like, watch this, y'all. And ultimately it backfires in his face. Yep. And another place, the more dark version of this, is Haman at the very end of the story has a gallows built in order to kill Mordecai, his hated enemy, and Esther's cousin, who is acting as her father, essentially, in the story. And Haman, instead of being the one who is who's using it, ends up being the one killed on it. Yeah,
and instead of Haman being exalted by Xerxes, Mordecai is exalted. Instead of Mordecai being hung, Haman is hung.
There's so many places of irony, some dark, some light, some kind of light, there's light humor going on there. Others very serious. So that's one thing we got to watch out for. The second thing is satire directed at Persian men. This is so good. So in the first chapter, we see this great thing where the men desire to control their women, like, I am the man of the house and I'm the one in total control. And ultimately, they're shown of the complete inability that they have of Persian men to control their wives.
And let's not just pick on Persian men.
Right. There's a level of, but the satire is that A, they have the relationship wrong. Scripturally, that's not how the relationship works. And B, they were really afraid of 5th century BC feminism.
They were.
I hope that everyone listening recognizes that this is all tongue-in-cheek on our end.
Yeah, but it is something that's very real in chapter 1.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. And that we're totally on the side of the author in making fun of and mocking what Persian men were taking very seriously.
Exactly.
The final thing is recurring motifs. This is number 3. A motif is just a fancy word for a distinctive feature or a dominant idea in a work of art. So, for example, in the book of Esther, as you're reading through it, it's only 10 chapters long. It's like 176 verses. It's not a terribly long book. If you were to read through it a few times, some stuff that would stand out to you most likely would be the importance of banquets. Yeah. They're all over the place in the book of Esther. Another thing would be like conflicts throughout. You'll see that all the different sub-levels of conflicts. We mentioned one. The men and women, the conflict between men and women, you've got...
There's the whole conflict of good versus evil.
Right.
Yeah.
You've got good versus evil. You've got Haman and Mordecai. You've got the Jews versus everyone who takes the Jews out. Yep. You've even got conflict between Esther and Mordecai. Because Esther does not want to save her people necessarily because she's afraid for her life. Yeah. And Mordecai...
You stick your neck out, it can get chopped off.
Mordecai is this great phrase. I've used a lot during the pandemic, which is, for such a time as this. That's how he kind of gets her. And it's like, oh, You know, how are you going to fight that? Maybe you're queen for such a time as this. We'll get there later on. But that's some of the touch points. Another touch point is lots of twos. If there's one thing, you shouldn't be surprised if you see it happen again later on in the book. Like, for example, there are two gatherings of women. The first gathering of women is to get a queen who will replace Vashti. Mm-hmm. The second gathering is actually Esther gathering the women to pray for her before she goes to ask for the life of her people. So just look out for lots of twos. Another place would be Haman, the enemy of the Jews, asks for advice from his wife and friends twice, mm-hmm. which is interesting. And both times he gets really bad advice. Yeah. It's like not the thing he should go do. But those are like two examples. There are multiple examples of twos throughout the book of Esther. And these are just recurring motifs that provide structure and intrigue to the narrative. So that's the background to the book of Esther. Now we're going to go through chapter 1. I'm reading from the English Standard Version. I don't know, just one quirk that I ran across from different versions. How does the NIV translate the king's name? Does it say Ahasuerus or does it say Xerxes?
Xerxes in the NIV.
See, interestingly enough, in the ESV, it says Ahasuerus.
Same person.
This is the same person, and here's why these two books do different things. ESV is more of a literal translation, and in the Hebrew Bible, it's the Aramaic Ahasuerus. Mm-hmm. So every time you see the king's name, it's King Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus, Ahasuerus. But we know from extra-biblical data that this is the same person as Xerxes.
His Greek name.
Right.
Yeah.
And Xerxes, by the way, you'd know him if you've watched the movie 300. This Xerxes, same guy who defeats the 300, same guy who goes and loses, because at the end of the movie they go and then the Greeks beat him. Same guy who loses actually a couple years later to the Greeks. So that's Xerxes or Ahasuerus. So if you're reading through your Bible and we say Xerxes and your Bible says Ahasuerus, or we say Ahasuerus and your Bible says Xerxes, same guy. But here's what it says, verses 1 through 9. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the princes were before him, while he showed the riches, his royal glory, and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days. 180 days. That's 6 months for those of you who are counting. That's a long time to show off your power. Though I did read in one commentary that this is potentially when he was making plans for war against Greeks. And that's why the armies were there and the generals were there for this thing, because it wasn't just a big party. It was also let's start making plans to go finish what my dad Darius started, mm-hmm. In conquering the Greeks. So that's verse 4. Verse 5, and when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. And there were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen and purple to silver rods and marble pillars. And also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. This is some serious detail going on here, just for y'all. He's being very specific about this. Drinks were served in golden vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict: there is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. And Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Anything jump out at you in this section before
this is one big party that is going on, not only for the 180, but then specifically for the 7 days. Lots of drinking.
Yes. Well, and it wasn't just for the royals. It was from the greatest to the least. This was for anybody who was a part of the city of Susa could come and drink and celebrate, and just one massive party.
Well, you mentioned something earlier when we were talking, and I didn't realize that normally you didn't drink until the king drank.
Yeah.
And that's when you would be allowed to drink, but he just says, hey, everyone, enjoy yourself.
It's right. Lots of debauchery was most likely going on. There was a lot of, this is a big party. So that's one of the things that was kind of going on in this. Who's Ahasuerus?
Ahasuerus is Xerxes.
Right, and how does he connect in kind of biblical history? Who's he related to?
Well, he is the son of Darius, and for those of you who think, where have I heard that before? Darius is famous in Daniel's book because it was Darius who threw Daniel into the lion's den, and that's Xerxes' dad.
Yep.
And his grandfather would be Cyrus the Great, who allowed, after 70 years of captivity, the Israelites to go back to Israel and to return to Jerusalem.
Right, to rebuild the temple, because Cyrus had a strong policy of allowing people to return to their homes and then rebuild their temples to their gods, whereas the previous kind of dictatorial leadership, like Nebuchadnezzar, and even before that, was very much you worship me and you worship me alone.
Yep.
And even Darius struggled with that a little bit, as we see in the Lion's Den episode, where he's like, you can have your gods, but I'm the biggest god, you worship me. So that's part of the policy, the history behind Xerxes. Interestingly enough, Xerxes is the guy, like I said, who lost to the Greeks. He wasn't a particularly great tactician. When it came to history, does not remember Xerxes favorably. I mean, he gets the kind of victory, but then he does a whole bunch of series of failed attempts to finish conquering Greece, and he makes some tactical blunders that force him to kind of come home. Mm-hmm. And he's got his tail dragging behind dragging behind him. This is not a happy celebration. And some scholars believe that this is why there is a plot early on in his reign to assassinate him, and that's the same plot that Mordecai hears and foils.
Yeah.
That these are military folks who are like, hey, we can't trust Xerxes. He's already made us look bad once. He's not a great leader. We need a new guy, a strong leader. And ultimately, actually, Xerxes is assassinated by one of his generals.
Mm-hmm.
About decade and a half after this takes place. So that's Xerxes on the whole. He's not really that great of a king compared to his dad and his granddad.
But he did like splendor.
Yes, he did. He shows off. I mean, the way that he acts and operates shows off the personality of a person who was raised with royal splendor and had everything given to them whenever they wanted.
Yep.
This was a person who only knew luxury and was okay showing off that luxury to other people.
And when he wanted something, he expected it to be given right away.
Which is what we're going to see here in just a little bit. Where's Susa? Susa, if you don't know, is actually in modern-day Iran. Mm-hmm. It's just north of the Persian Gulf, actually. It would be 200 miles northeast of Babylon at the time. So this was considered the winter capital because it was closer to the water. I mean, you have all sorts of reasons that this could be the wintering city, winter capital. But this is where he was finishing building some stuff Darius had started. Which is probably the best thing that Xerxes is known for beyond, the 300, is that he finished some incredible stuff that his dad, construction projects that his dad started. So that's Xerxes, and that's Susa. So what's going on in this verse? You mentioned it already. This big party happening. He's got 6 months of collaboration and talking with folks and showing off his wealth, and then a 7-day massive party. How much, you mentioned this earlier as well, how much partying was going on, so much partying that decorum was out the window. It was like, you guys party as much as you want. We're all going to drink bunches, okay? According to the amount that was in the king's treasury, which is a lot.
A lot.
And that's what happens. And then you get this kind of throwaway phrase at the end of verses 1 through 9 where it says, Queen Vashti was doing what?
Also giving a banquet for the women.
So it's almost get this idea of she didn't want to have anything to do with what was going on over with Xerxes or Ahasuerus and his party. So she's doing her own thing over in this other section. It's not necessary that that's the case, but that's the kind of sense you get from it.
Yeah, his is just a bunch of guys drinking and
carrying
being wild,
on.
And the women, they're acting like a bunch of animals.
Yeah, that's kind of the sense you get. Yeah, and if we kind of get that confirmed in verses 10 through 22, would you read that for us?
On the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits for wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zathar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Ooh. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king: Karshena, Sethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan. I knew I'd get it eventually. I've been having too much wine.
Well, I'll tell you what, biblical names are tough, y'all.
And I know that's why he had me read this section. Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the law of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice, so the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should rule over his own household.
I'm laughing through this whole section because it's absurd and stupid, and yet you could see a bunch of guys getting together and doing this.
Well, I don't know if I've told you the story. When I was on vicarage, this guy came into my office. Vicarage is that year internship for would-be pastors. Yeah. And he said, Vicar John, you need to talk to my wife. I said, what's going on? He goes, well, she's just not listening to me the way she's supposed to. And the Bible says that she is my helper, so she's supposed to be listening to me. And I really thought this was a setup from my supervising pastor, just having this guy come in, but he was serious. Oh, wow. This whole idea that the man's word is law is what's being mimicked here.
Yeah, you can just see the sarcasm and the satire dripping from the author of the book of Esther, because these guys are over the top on their response to this. Or this was really Xerxes, and Xerxes was kind of, petulant in a lot of ways, because Vashti, rightfully so, says, nah, I'm not coming for y'all to ogle me. I'm not going to come over there with a bunch of drunk guys. Yeah. Are you kidding me? No way.
That's disrespectful.
Yeah, this is not how you treat your wife. And then Xerxes responds to that by issuing a national decree saying that wives are supposed to respect their husbands, and Vashti's getting deposed as queen.
Well, again, you mentioned this, the irony. The one that was being disrespected was Vashti.
Yeah.
And yet the men took an affront because she wasn't going to play their game.
Right. And they all of a sudden are like, oh my gosh, we might have, chaos and uncertainty. I'm reminded of the Mary Poppins, the opening song from The Dad, and one of the lines goes, "In short, you have a ghastly mess." When he's talking about how a household should be run and how it should be done like this, and the man's word is law, and all that sorts of stuff. Same kind of thing going on here. These heads over here, and absolutely, Ahasuerus was in the wrong.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about that in just a little bit.
Well, and Luther had a great quote. And I will often share this during like a Mother's Day message. He said, "The hand that rocks the cradle rules the world." He had a wonderful appreciation for the different sexes, man and female, how they come together and work together for the common good. It's not one being the boss and the other being the slave. God's design is, the Hebrew word is etzer. They're suitable for one another because they provide what the other one is lacking, and they go together as a team. That's God's intent, design for marriage. Unfortunately, Xerxes' attitude is not foreign to us today.
No, it's not. And it's just broken people are broken people. And 2,500 years later, we're still broken the way that they were broken. One of the things that, immediately red flag, if we're reading this as a historical narrative with wisdom motifs running through it, what's the first thing? The first thing we read that says red flag, this is going to not result in anything good when we get to this section.
Let's drink and drink and drink some more.
Yeah, right. It says, the king was merry with wine. As soon as you get that, if you know your Proverbs, if you know the rest of Scripture, you know that this is not going to end well for anyone involved. And it does not end well for Ahasuerus or for Xerxes. The author is just reminding us again and again, if you're a leader, it is not a good thing to get drunk, whether publicly or privately. You've got too much responsibility on your shoulders for that. What is Vashti's justified response to the king's summons?
She refuses.
Yeah.
She does not, and rightly so, does not want to be treated as an object.
Right. The two things that the king does in response is what? We talked about it, but...
Yeah, he gets angry.
Yeah.
I told you to come, and you didn't come.
Right.
So...
But then what does he do?
Well, then he gets the guys together.
Right, he gets his inner circle.
Yeah, what am I supposed to do about this?
Guys, she didn't come. What do I do? It's just kind of like this, I was never expecting that to happen. And then they all get together.
Yeah, as two guys, we can laugh at man's stupidity, man in the male gender.
Yeah.
Sometimes we're just really a bunch of jerks.
So these guys, and he gathers these guys together, and these guys, the phrase that's used in both books, both ESV at least and the NIV, is the people who knew the times, guys who were in touch with the times. What were these guys who were in tune with the national kind of spirit of the age? What does this phrase mean, and what were they sensing?
Well, they understood culture. Yeah. And if the queen can disrespect the king, what does that say about all the other women treating their husbands? Isn't it interesting that when we feel threatened, we want to legislate?
Yeah.
And this is a power grab, and oftentimes when people feel like they're threatened, they want to legislate things so that they can get it their way. And when you feel like you have to start grabbing for power, we need to understand that's never been God's way. It certainly was not Jesus' way. He gave up power in order to serve, and yet fallen human beings tend to want to grab the power in order to promote survival.
Right, promote their own survival, be comfortable, have their own kind of, going back to the first sin, be the God in their own little realm, and that everything goes their way. And we see this just playing out in a ridiculous sort of way in Esther chapter 1. What do they fear will be we talked about this a little bit, but what do they fear will be the result of Vashti's refusal?
Chaos.
Yep, chaos, uncertainty, wrath, contempt in plenty. That they're like, oh my gosh, we're not going to have the same control we had before. Yeah. We got to legislate this and make sure that we maintain control. And this author is just poking so much fun at this desire to control and legislate control, and the desire, the fear that these men have, these Persian men have in their culture. Mm-hmm. What should Ahasuerus or Xerxes have done?
Well, the first thing he should have done, if he was wise at all, is to realize how foolish he was, and to ask for forgiveness, because he was making his wife some spectacle to impress other people. And so he was the one that should have been coming to Vashti to say, hey, I am really sorry. Mm-hmm. But he's the king. Mm-hmm. And kings very rarely, if ever, apologize. Mm-hmm. And Xerxes doesn't. So first, he should have asked for forgiveness. Mm-hmm. He should have behaved with humility and grace, because he was being a real jerk.
What does he do, though? He's not a wise fella. He's not a great guy. What does he do?
Well, not only does he get bad insight from his nobles, but he gets bad insight from his nobles who've been drinking for a week. And he goes, this sounds really good.
Let's do it, y'all. Yeah. And he's on like signet ring, boom, it can't be revoked. Yeah. You know,
which goes to show that the author really understands the legislative history of the Medes and the Persians. Once it was written, even the king couldn't rescind it. It's done. And we're going to see this played out later in the book.
And we see this too with Daniel as well, where his father Darius, because of bad advice from from people who were against Daniel, signed something in the law that cannot be revoked at that point. So we see this kind of all over the place. This is good insight when it comes to the Median Persian Empire and its laws. So who's really in control in this situation then? What's going on here?
Well, I think what we're going to see is that in spite of Xerxes' stupidity, arrogance, pride, in spite of Vashti, who's taking a stand, and I would say rightfully so, all this is being used by God behind the scenes, because this is going to set the stage for next week's lesson.
Right, because it was signed into law the way that it was decreed the way that it was. He couldn't go back on it when he thought better of it later on, which he does think better of it later on in chapter 2. I mean, there's a little kind of Greco-Persian war that happens in between this time and when he comes back and starts thinking about it. Most likely that's what happens in between chapter 1 and 2. But, what he does sets in place, God uses it in order to prepare the way to save his people, which is just fantastic.
Well, and I think it's very comforting to us, because how often, us just people in general, do we do really stupid things? Yeah. And sometimes we think, I saw this the other day, someone said, I'm just afraid that I have completely ruined God's plan for my life. And the response was, rejoice, you are not that powerful. God works in spite of our rebellion.
Which is huge for the 21st century. Anyhow, that's chapter 1. Hope y'all enjoyed spending some time with us today in chapter 1. Next week, you can read ahead, chapter 2. Just fascinating things going on in chapter 2, and some stuff sets the ball rolling because really chapter 1 is almost like a prologue that sets up the rest of the book.
Right.
Chapter 2, we meet the heroine, we meet some of the main actors that are going on in the rest of the book of Esther, and we see kind of how God begins to deliver his people from an event they don't even know is going to happen yet.
Yeah, and he's working behind the scenes.
Yep, Festival of Purim. Take care, and we'll talk again next time.